Well, good afternoon, everyone. We are in the final session of the Florida Libraries Online Fostering Resilient Communities virtual conference. This session is a part of our Community Connections track brought to you by TBLC, the Tampa Bay Library Consortium. You will receive an email after today's conference containing a link to a survey, so please be sure that you complete that for us because it gives us guidance on developing events for Florida Library staff, and it makes an impact on our funding for the future. So this session is Mind the Gap, Connecting Academic Libraries and Campus Communities. It's created and presented by Nancy Kranich, and Nancy teaches community engagement, information policy, and intellectual freedom at the Rutgers University School of Communication and Information. She works on special projects with Rutgers University Libraries. Past president of the American Library Association, she founded ALA Center for Civic Life and the library's Foster Community Engagement Membership Initiative group. We're very happy to have Nancy here, so welcome.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you to everyone who's joining me today. I'm delighted to be back in Florida. I came to Florida to speak when I was president of ALA, and I have such wonderful memories. So I'm really glad to be back, even though it's a little bit different circumstances. But as Amber said, this was always planned for online. So, so I'm very glad to do our social distancing and be politically correct for the moment. So I'm also delighted to be following Amber Williams, who I have known through my work with the Harwood Institute. And as I think you, if you were on the last session, are aware that Amber is one of our movers and shakers. So when you get involved with doing work like I'm going to talk about today, then you become a mover and shaker. So before I get started, why don't I just ask you, I am assuming most of you are academic librarians, but could you type in if you're not, so I have a sense to include other kinds of libraries. This is going to focus more on academic libraries, but it's not exclusively academic libraries. So that way I can get a sense of our audience, which I always like to do anyway. So thank you. I'll look and see what's going on here. Yeah. So, yeah, academic librarians, go academics, right. So I think community engagement is a terminology that most people think of as what goes on in our towns and villages, but I use community engagement in a much broader way. So why don't we go on to the next screen while we're seeing more about who our attendees are. Academic. State College, yeah, okay. So unless I see there's others, I'm gonna feel comfortable talking about the Academy today. So this is a picture of a man named Alfred North Whitehead. And he talked about the task of the university is the creation of the future, so far as rational thought and civilized modes of appreciation can affect the issue. He was a philosopher and a mathematician, and he ended his rich teaching career at Harvard. And so he was trying to envision then, also in a period when the United States was in crisis, probably, similar rethinking about where the country was going, trying to figure out how to reinvent the university.
These have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, reflection of systematic inequalities in access to quality healthcare, housing, and jobs. This is NPR News.
Right a minute. Sorry.
The Department of Justice is waging.
Right. Sorry about that. Gosh. Okay. So back to the future here. So you want to go on to the next slide? So what does that mean for university libraries? Why should we care about where the university or colleges are going? So indeed, libraries are about, in my mind at least, co-creating the future in concert with our campus community and our campus colleagues. I'm not sure, though, that this is the way many faculty and students see their campus libraries. I'm sure like you or like us at Rutgers, your libraries are grappling with trying to reimagine your roles at an unimaginable time. Here at Rutgers in New Jersey, we're certainly having troubles every day trying to figure out where we're going. We're in COVID-19 central, although things are getting better in New Jersey. I know they're not doing quite as well, perhaps in Florida in the same direction, but we've been through 100 days of being in the hot spot of the country and maybe the world. So I'm assuming you're having the same issues. And so I would say that today's conference is a good way to start thinking about where are we going together. So unfortunately, we don't really have a single compelling narrative that replaces the more traditional one that we had, which I call the book warehouse notion. And so sometimes I start off talks, particularly non-librarians, I just draw a picture of a library, just, a building. And I ask them what comes to mind when you look at that picture of the library. And they say, books. So it says to me that, I'm getting a sense from the audiences that I talk to, particularly the non-library audiences, that we still have, that people still have embedded in their minds that idea of the book warehouse. So we have to reinvent ourselves for our community, maybe not for ourselves, but for our community. So, but we also have to remember that the library has no destiny independent of the organization or community it serves. We're part of something else. So more than 10 years ago, the University of Minnesota Libraries launched an extraordinary multi-year process of positioning, of putting the libraries in a more strategic position on campus within the diverse community that they served and within the within the academy. So then the library director at the time, Wendy Luget, who's a real visionary in our field, talked about libraries' traditional role focusing on the products of scholarship, but that they meaning libraries, are now prompted to understand and support the processes of scholarship. And I think this is a really deep and moving rethinking of who we are, because the products of scholarship are very static, whereas the processes of scholarship are really very agile and moving. So when we think about what we do, we have to think in very different ways when we use those two sort of competing notions of who we are and where we're going. So blazing the way for many libraries, in Minnesota, I might add, won the ACRL Library of the Year award for this work, and it was very exciting, their proposal, and they won that award for good reason. Minnesota itself committed early on to moving from a collection-centered to an engagement-centered model of service, demonstrating that engagement, embedding, and getting in the flow of our users would be the new buzz for increasing our value on our campuses. And these themes are now, a decade later, being widely adopted. At least they were being widely adopted before the pandemic struck. So to me, this is what co-creation, as discussed by Alfred North Whitehead, was really about: allowing and encouraging more active involvement with our campus community so we can create a value-rich experience for those who are getting involved with us and for those we are getting involved with ourselves. So in short then, co-creation involves setting up new modes of engagement that allow individuals to insert themselves in the value chain of the organization. And in a COVID-19 world, that process takes on a whole new dimension. But this whole idea of a value chain, again, is very dynamic. It's not static. So next slide. So what kind of new paradigms then come out of this shift from what Luget calls from product to process. So I think you'll agree that today's libraries are disrupted organizations. What all libraries, not just academic, but certainly in the academy. So inside their parent institutions, colleges and universities, their parents are being totally reconfigured. So much so that most are uncertain whether we're going to teach in September, let alone where we're going to go once we, maybe get beyond this pandemic and beyond the recession that's trickling down. Very quickly in New Jersey, we're already seeing layoffs at Rutgers. So how should we respond to these disruptive paradigm shifts? Going from product to process, from scarcity to abundance, something, those of you who are old enough to remember what I remember in library land is we used to talk about scarcity, no more. From outside in to inside out. And Amber talked a little bit about this as, turning outward. From push to pull. A really important concept, she talked about advocacy versus really getting to know the community, letting the community decide. So that's the push to pull paradigm. And from transactional to relational. So it's not just about a transaction again, it's about building relationships. From destiny to journey. From local to shared. So much of, Tampa Bay, what you do is share. So much of what we're doing now is really becoming almost global. And from size rankings to impact assessment. So, until recently and even now, it's the size of your collection that determines your identity. And then from that just in case to just in time kind of mentality. In short then, how do we go beyond what I call our edifice complex, that building with walls? We don't have to talk too much about walls these days to know that walls can be a problem, and they're not just a problem politically and on borders and around the White House, but they're also a problem of conceiving our libraries differently. Indeed then, so how do we learn from these months without our buildings to become truly engaged as co-creators? And I think we're all making up as we go. So more than 80 years after Whitehead wrote, the fit of academic libraries within the academic enterprise is contested. And if any of you want to write in chat that some examples of perhaps that you find that it's not so contested, we'd love to learn more about how you are getting beyond that sort of contested identity of your role in the academic enterprise. So for about the last 30 years, academic libraries have transformed themselves to reflect sweeping changes in scholarly communication and teaching. I don't have to tell you how significant they are. So everything from cloud computing, open access publishing, and social networks are also transforming us. Yet I think most of us in library land or academic library land and our teaching faculty colleagues probably can't agree on how today's academic library should accommodate all these changes. And I'm going to focus a lot more on that, what I call disconnect problem as we go along here. So how should we as academic librarians and librarians in other fields, as other kinds of libraries as well, respond to these disruptive shifts going on in the identity of our academic libraries or the identity of all kinds of libraries? And to date, I don't think that there is a single compelling narrative that has emerged to replace the metaphors of yesteryear. So, and you can see I have this build it and they will come notion here. We're going to go back to that toward the end of the discussion, but I think we're no longer in that world where if we build it, they will show up. So next slide. So we got a lot of disconnects here, and if you can think of some, I'd love to see you add some in the chat as we go through them. And I'm not going to go through these one by one, but I want you to think about some of them. You know, like disconnects related to collections, to databases, etc. I'm going to pick up some of these themes later, but to become co-creators, we have to get beyond these disconnects we're experiencing. Too often librarians tell one story about our efforts, while faculty, students, and administrators tell another. And just as Amber was talking about listening to your community, I'll talk about that as well. When you listen to people talk about you rather than you talk to them about you, you can have some very different conversations and realize we're on two somewhat separate planets. So I could list lots of ways we have trouble talking to each other, but just one example. We're investing in expensive web discovery tools for a user community that hardly ever starts with our websites. And we're doing a redesign of our website right now at Rutgers. So another thing we're doing is building these institutional repositories that scholars hardly use. And you might type in some examples of these. I'm going to pick up this thread later, but just think about it, you know, copyright. We talk about copyright in one way, but I'm not sure our colleagues in the university even are thinking about the same issues, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Information literacy, one of my favorite. Does anybody who teaches understand what we're talking about? Sometimes I wonder if we understand what we're talking about. But anyway, I'll let you imagine what kinds of disconnects you can attach to some of these functions that we undertake at our academic libraries. So next slide. So our dilemma. So we're using a lot of D's today, disconnects, dilemmas. I usually use A's and C's, so we're into D's today. So since I teach, I don't know if D's are such a good thing, but we will use all these D's. So our challenge, but also dilemma then, is to create a promising future between library students and faculty by bridging these differences we have in disciplines and campus locations, the differences we have with each other. So here's how John Palfrey, who started the Digital Library of America, characterized this dilemma. He said libraries are in danger because they're caught between two ideas that are not necessarily reconciled. On the one hand, public sentiment that the digital era has made libraries less relevant. And I would tell you, as ALA president, the most common question I got from the media was, why do we still need libraries? And that was 20 years ago. So think about that, you know. And on the other, he said, the growing number of expectations we have for libraries stemming in no part from the very digitalization that the public assumes is making them obsolete. So these ideas cannot both be right. So, you know, the world is digital, so we no longer need libraries, back to the book warehouse notion. But on the other hand, isn't everything electronic now? And shouldn't we, you know, there's just a growing number of expectations of what we should be doing. So how do we reconcile all this? So let me give you a little historical view of how we got this way. Let's go to the next slide. So I call it the centralization movement, which I think is still going on and could be the centralization and fully online movement as we move forward. So up until the end of the 20th century, students, faculty, and administrators considered the library the heart of the academic enterprise. I remember when I was at New York University, we wrote this fancy brochure and we talked about how we were the heart and soul of the university. I'm not sure we get that same reaction today. So, but one of the reasons people felt that way about us is because we were out there interacting daily, side by side, with our respective faculty and colleagues and with students. in branch libraries, specialized libraries, as well as central libraries, where they physically also resided. When I was at Wisconsin, everybody had, every faculty member who was anything got themselves a private carrel in the library, or they had their own branch library right down the hall from their department. So as our institutions changed and our finances changed and new methods for creating and disseminating scholarly information emerged, the campus community no longer used the library to identify scarce resources, remember the scarceness to abundance, or to retrieve materials from what used to be closed stacks. I remember those days, you probably don't, and to study quietly in those isolated research carrels. So in the early 80s, when libraries began automating many of our processing techniques and providing remote access to many collections, it allowed us to centralize more efficiently, so we didn't have to have so many duplicate collections and we could come together, and as well as consolidate a multitude of departmental and branch libraries. So when I was in Wisconsin, we had 89 libraries, and one of my jobs was as an interlibrary loan runner for one of the branch campuses. And I would ride my bike between these 89 libraries to retrieve things. So I don't think they have 89 libraries anymore. University of Illinois, I think, had 99. So, you know, I don't think you're seeing too many institutions with all those libraries anymore. So not surprisingly, though, with centralization and automation came less and less face-to-face contact between us and particularly the faculty, but also students. So we fell into what I would consider a more passive role, where we were stewards of collections that were published outside our universities, instead of being functioning as partners in the central research and learning processes. So this is again picking up on this idea of going from product to process, you know, that dynamic part of what we can and maybe should be doing. So we were teaching bibliographic instruction in those days to show students how to find books and articles that we purchased out, you know, from outside and just housed in the library. So it wasn't really about the resources of the university as getting access to the resources of people outside the university. So in those days, and I think still today, collection size was our measure. I remember talking to faculty at UCLA when they were looking for a new library director, and they told me that our biggest concern was staying up in the top 5 of research libraries in the number of volumes. So that wasn't that long ago. And very rarely beyond that number would you see anything about libraries in academic leaders' reports about their universities. You know, they'd give you that number and then they'd go on to other things, bigger and better things perhaps. So what happened, I think, was that people on campus started to really take libraries for granted. Our activities became quiet and often unrecognized. And I think some of us feel that way today, that we're still not recognized. So as print content migrated to digital, libraries offered remote access that led to disintermediation in the discovery process. So we got more disconnected. People, okay, here's somebody with an example, small to full time, we were stepping up. Yeah, so that they, yeah. So, right, some good examples, right? So as costs for serials and digital collections skyrocketed, we were dropping in the number of book acquisitions. Our circulation has plummeted. Our on-site reference has plummeted. And those are the ways we were interacting with people before. And Google has basically replaced the library as the go-to place to initiate, if not complete, many research assignments. So even my husband, who's a distinguished scholar at Rutgers, he always starts with Google. That's the go-to place. Then if he has to, he'll go to our catalog, but we won't get into how confusing that can be for many, even those who are quite skilled as scholars. So these trends have changed the role of libraries And sometimes they've even led to very uncomfortable and distasteful negotiations involving those limited acquisition budgets and journal cuts. So we had to go, the conversation we were busy having was a conversation about how to cut their serials rather than, what their aspirations and concerns were. So today, rather than spending our time selecting those materials, we rely on approval plans, demand-driven acquisitions, and bundled purchasing. So we don't even have to do a lot of that stuff anymore. So I'm not lamenting those days. I'm telling you, when I used to do selection and other kinds of activities, they were tedious. So I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, but they have removed us from that connecting with our community. So, by not having to do these things anymore, by being more efficient, it has freed us up to do the more personalized support for the process, as Wendy Leger calls it, of research and learning. Processes like using citation software, productivity and research attribution tools, data planning, analysis, archiving, expertise databases, personal archiving, showcasing localized materials through digital repositories, and publishing open access journals, not only encouraging people to publish in them, but we've been publishing them ourselves. So it's freed us up in many ways, in good ways, to collaborate more, to improve student research and critical thinking skills. We're looking at critical thinking, information literacy, no longer just bibliographic instruction, how to find a book in the library. And we've been reconfiguring our facilities to promote more collaborative research projects, learning commons, data visualization, and creative markets, maker spaces, like somebody just 3D printing, et cetera. We can do a whole lot more physically now, except for, I don't know what we're going to go back to when Rutgers closed with 2 days notice. We were just in the midst of finalizing our brand new information commons, and I can't imagine how we're going to be able to host such a facility in the future, but that's another issue. So instead of focusing now on those old school kinds of activities, we are freed up to do a whole lot more that's part of the process. And historically, that's been a big evolution. So the possibilities are vast, and I'm sure each one of you could tell me some great examples of ones that you are pursuing. But this kind of innovation requires mutual exploration by librarians and their campus constituents together. Stated a 2015 OCLC study about this very issue. It said, "It is far too easy to make incorrect assumptions about users' needs and motives. Libraries need to step outside of their comfort zone in looking at the user in the life of the library and look instead at the library in the life of the user." And this statement really parallels what Amber said before about advocacy, where you're talking about your greatness to your community versus talking with your community about how do they see greatness. Very similar. So that whole notion, that flipping it. So let's talk a little bit about these disconnects again, but go back to our Ds. Next slide. So you're probably wondering why I have a slide with roach motels, but you're going to have to hang on to figure it out. But we'll see if you can figure it out before I get there. So anyway, so many find new offerings unfamiliar because many of our users find new offerings unfamiliar because they're not yet fully diffused. We have them, but they're not really out there. So Wendy Leger's idea of diffusing libraries, well, we've got to diffuse all the tools of libraries, all the services, all the resources more effectively. Plus, lots of people are unaware of these new services and priorities, even when they are available. Because I also teach, I'm involved with lots of the teaching faculty on campus. And I will tell you, even the teaching faculty who teach in library and information science half the time do not know what we're offering at the library. And one of the reasons is, back to our websites. how can you even find this stuff? You know, at our library, you have to go through maybe four layers to find a LibGuide. Or to find our digital repository. I mean, I can never remember how to find it. It's ridiculous, right? So if we can't find it, you know, buried under all these layers, how are other people going to find it? And we often use communication vehicles that just don't resonate. I mean, I'm always amazed I can send somebody a message 10 times that they don't read it. So sending it to them 11 times is not going to make them read it more. So, but you know, we just have to get in the flow of our users more. Plus, as we've added more services remotely, our role becomes even more invisible to faculty members and administrators who interact less with librarians. I mean, I'm just curious with all of you, how much you've been interacting with your faculty since we closed our doors. You know, we may not have interacted much before, but interacting now becomes even more challenging. So I think about this reality, how this reality has played out in the last 3 months. And it's really, I think, demonstrated that it's hard to be visible in an invisible world. And faculty and students just don't realize what we're doing. I think they're really appreciative when we do stuff. I don't want to sound negative, but I think we all agree that we could do so much more if we had a better way to make it clear what we're doing. So anyway, so back to this notion that we share one narrative and faculty, students, and administrators embrace another, and it may not be the same one. So community members continue to value the library. I think, you know, and particularly now, I think people really value what we offer if they know what it is, but they're less dependent and more ambivalent about what that means. So there's a group called Ithaca S&R. If you haven't read their publications, they do really marvelous research. It's a think tank in New York that considers the future of libraries and scholarly communication. They concluded in a recent study, quote, "The library is in many ways falling off the radar screens of faculty. Although librarians may still be providing significant value to their constituency, the value of their brand is decreasing." Now, if this makes you feel uncomfortable, I'm sorry. But I think it's not happening universally, but I think a lot of the research verifies that we're sort of on two, maybe not different planets, but definitely in different spheres. So when you get into open, as a really good example, open access initiatives such as institutional repositories and open access journals, I want to illustrate these disconnects using those two examples. So initiatives that are supposed to provide this unfettered free access to peer-reviewed articles produced by our campus colleagues, a really good idea, right? They help the library reposition itself on campus by being the go-to place to preserve research output and counter spiraling costs for those scholarly publications. A really good idea. But it's proof that if we build it and they will come approach no longer works. We've built it and we've spent a whole lot of money building it and sustaining it. Yet, there's not a lot of use of most of these repositories. Too many campuses, only a few faculty members are actually depositing their scholarship. Here's a quote by some scholars that were interviewed on this topic. They said, and I thought this was really insightful, and I hadn't thought about it this way. By focusing the message on crisis, that's the crisis in the cost of serials, libraries fail to frame the IR, the institutional repository, in a way that resonated with faculty, who continue to have access to the majority of content they need via subscription services, and so have little incentive to engage with the IR simply to solve what is for them a non-issue. So we're still paying those huge prices to Elsevier. A few universities are just saying no, but we're undermining our own rationale for doing this because they're still getting those expensive journals. Another critique considered these repositories, quote, What do you think I'm going to say? Nobody's putting it in, so I guess I'll have to tell you. Roach motels that hold no value for many faculty, which inevitably means such repositories have no access to most faculty created content. And it's certainly a big problem where I am. I tend to be the one that has a lot of citations. You know, I'm like the most cited of the week on our IR, not because I'm so popular, but because I don't have that much competition. I love putting my stuff in there, including what I've written on this topic, because I tend to write in journals and books that aren't about libraries, so library people don't find me. Anyway, so one other critic felt that libraries had developed IRs without a user-centered understanding, just what we're talking about here, and have been slow to align development with needs. Building it alone doesn't make them come, said another observer, just completely in parallel to what I've been talking about. So in sum, differences between librarians, faculty, administrators do have consequences. And at the far extreme, even some library directors have lost their jobs over these disconnects. An article fittingly entitled "Clash in the Stacks" documented and captured the essence of the problem by asking how much change is appropriate. So if we're not there with our community, we can get ourselves in trouble. So it's not just a disconnect, it can be, you know, pretty fatal. So next slide. So how do librarians and campus administrators and faculty members begin to bridge this gap that we've got between the perceptions of the future of their library and their university, mind you? Because I will tell you, having a scholar and a former administrator in my family, my husband, that it's not clear where the university is going to many, not just where the library is going, particularly during such a disruptive period. How can we go beyond these disconnects to co-create the future? Examples of successful collaborations demonstrate possibilities all over. The possibilities that were demonstrated at the University of Minnesota is a good example, and there's been several publications, new models that have come out of that work. So in the last 5 years, libraries began embracing these new approaches. And Amber Williams talked to you about the Harwood Institute. Harwood has trained over 4,000 librarians, and some of them have been academic libraries. And at Rutgers, we have used these tools to help us turn outward toward our community. And so the good news is it's helping us to build more partnerships and collaborate beyond our walls. And revamping our jurisdictions beyond that edifice complex we talked about before. So by adopting a more engaged model of service in this disruptive era, I think we have a great opportunity to seize this moment to reconceptualize and articulate new roles for us in very transformative ways. So there's not one single model out there, but this whole notion of co-creation empowers us to get more actively involved in a value-rich experience using engagement, embedding, and getting in the flow of users, as I mentioned before, to permeate discussions. So how are we going to achieve this engagement model that I talked about? So let's go on to the next slide. I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to talk pretty fast here. So the simple solution is get more engaged. You know, some of us get engaged to get married. Others of us talk about engagement with our campus communities. But in fact, we really need to, you know, get engaged, literally, you know, plan to get married, get more connected, build our relationships. So we've got to understand our campus communities better, get more deeply rooted into the life of our community, and create a narrative around shared community aspirations. And because we have done this other work, to be more efficient, we can have more time to do this work now. So next slide. So that means we need to start connecting, and this parallel to what Amber talked about in the public library arena. Start by listening, have community conversations on campus. understand and identify people's shared aspirations. What do they want? Where do they want to go? Having authentic engagement that reflects their reality, and speaking with authority that reflects what we have, that we truly understand what they care about, not what we care about. And finally, having accountability for what we do. Amber talked about intentionality. So being intentional and then accountable for what we say we're going to do and doing it. So next slide. So when we start a planning process, we start by saying, you know, well, what's the problem here? And we have a long list of problems, and we use those problem lists to blame others. And it's rooted in complaints with no shared sense of direction. Other planning efforts start with visioning, with wish lists that are up at 30,000 feet, and they provide false hope. You want to be like the University of Minnesota, but you aren't the University of Minnesota. So it's not really rooted in people's reality. So we want to focus on aspirations, and Amber talked about this as well. When you start with people's aspirations, what they want and what they care about, you open the door to possibility, and that's really exciting. Next slide. So at Rutgers, if you look at this picture, we reinvented undergraduate education. This great graphic they did of the new undergraduate education about 10 years ago. Now, if you look really closely in 2 seconds, because I don't have much time left, you'll see all these great stops on this route of undergraduate education, but what is missing? The library. So when they did the transformation, they had 750 people on the implementation team. Only one was a librarian, and she was on the facilities committee. So you can understand from this that we had a long way to go. So next slide. So those of us at the library decided, well, we needed to start having community conversations, turn outward to our community, listen to them. We started with undergraduates, since that's where the transformation on campus was going. We moved into graduate, international. We did a lot of work internally. It's been a very exciting application of these hardwood tools. And the point is to act on what we hear and align our strategies with what's going on our campus. So it enables the building of relationships, partnering, and collaboration, something that Amber talked about. And so the discussions, as she talked about, shifted from selling our services, what she called advocacy, to identifying what the community cared about, where it wanted to go, and determine how to achieve those ideals together. And finding that common purpose with colleagues and students across the university made a huge difference for us. Not that it stuck, but that's another issue. But it really made a difference when we applied these techniques. So next slide. So turning outward then means having more inclusive public discourse, co-creating together, being part of the conversation, recognizing what's possible. And in this day and age in our libraries, possibility is so important. Finding our shared and realistic goals that'll work, finding a sense of common purpose, and becoming more relevant, significant, and having more deeper impact. And I think we're all looking for that. Back to this idea of intentionality, being very clear where we want to go, and how we might transform libraries and transform ourselves, transform librarians. And this work can be really exciting and really help to have you rethink, not how do you fit into what's happening, but how do you be part of what's happening? How do you co-create together? So next slide. So in conclusion then, let me say that the challenge is, how do we co-create the future together? We have such a great moment here, although it may not feel so good, to really turn outward and drive change. And no time, I think, have libraries been more important to the future of our universities and our communities than now. So how can we see the future as big with every possibility of achievement, as Alfred North Whitehead imagined almost 80 years ago? So thank you so much. We have not much time for questions, but maybe Kelly will let us stay on because I don't think there's anybody behind after me. I've got in my slides, next slide, a very short bibliography. I've done a lot of writing on this, so my own stuff. You can see lots of citations in some of this work. And next slide. Thanks so much. I've really enjoyed my time with you, and I've been sort of following your comments, and I hope that you will continue to think about some of these ideas, and I'd love to hear from you. Let's see, we have a model where we do an opt-out model, and each liaison librarian adds publications for the faculty. We just did a major liaison what should I say, transformation project at Rutgers. So I'm glad to see the word liaison. Is what does that mean, and how can we use that to really do this kind of turning outward that puts us in the flow of our users and really helps us to co-create the future of our departments, our students, our whole university. So somebody says that being involved in non-library events on my campus has helped our faculty engagement. Thank you. That's exactly it. Being out there doing things, getting out of your buildings, and now you're out of them. You may not be able to circulate much on campus, but when you start being there with them, the handwriting is sort of written on the wall for you. You don't need a plan. They tell you. And you can work together then and come up with wonderful, innovative ways to really strike it rich and find a new paths to co-create a future together. So if you are going to wait for faculty students to come to you, you'll be waiting forever. Yes, right. That's the build it and they'll come problem. Identifying how you can help and offering to collaborate usually has much better results. Yep. So some of those C words, collaborate, communicate, right? Partnering with student affairs, absolutely. And we started with student affairs. They decided to have their graduation ball in the reference room. Some librarians were aghast. It was so cool. They had a band, and they put a platform on top of the reference desk and talk about a transformation. And students had such a good feeling about the library, not because they used our books, but because the library, they felt it was theirs. Yes, so yeah. So let's see, partnering, yes. Camille, I work so closely with student life, yes. And so I'm doing a big project right now with voting and trying to help our civic engagement people on campus that are working on getting out the vote. But there's so much more we can do with student affairs than just getting them to register and vote. You know, doing dialogue about the issues, getting involved with student groups. One of the things they told us when we did the undergraduate community conversations is they said the problem with faculty and librarians, you go home at night just when the campus comes alive for students. Be there when they're there, you know, get into there. I mean, maybe you don't have to stay up all night, but you know, we come to work in the morning and they're, you know, sound asleep. So getting in their flow. We've connected greatly on social media. Yep. I don't know, some of you may be from community colleges. I love to go to community college conference sessions because I find that community colleges have tapped into this energy of their campuses sometimes a whole lot better than research libraries have, like mine, that are so, you know, stuck on trying to manage our great collections that we kind of forget to connect. So yeah. Yes, letting student clubs meet in the library, some obvious stuff. This doesn't take any money. All it takes is ideas. If you sit with them and they say they need a place to meet, oh, come to the library. Oh, making the library more welcoming, you know, that very simple idea. Not expensive to be welcoming. Even your chat reference, think about, you know, how do you do it to make people feel, you know, welcome and co-creating with you, that you're working with them. So many opportunities. So you're using a Twitter account to make yourself more visible. And, you know, one of the things that is really important for us to think about too is how we can help faculty improve their scholarly identity using these tools. Don't think because they're faculty, they have a clue. So when we shut down with 2 days notice, it was unbelievable how many of my colleague faculty friends asked me how to do things, that they were clueless. You know, they brought their DVD into the classroom. How do I show it online? How do I get on Kaltura? How do I get on, you know, they didn't know any of these platforms, and the librarians could have been a great help. And some of us were, but we can't assume that any of our colleagues really know about this, or students use Facebook or whatever. Social media doesn't mean they have any notion of how to use these other tools. So, and nobody's better equipped to help, but we've got to get in the flow of our users to help them. And so that means they have to somehow recognize that we are partners with them in this endeavor. When I did some strategic planning years ago, we started with a visioning process, and we talked about our vision, and we took the word support out, and we added the word partner in, because support sounds like your support staff, you know, that you help what they do, but you're really partners with them. We're equals. We're not just co-inventing and co-creating, but we're also, you know, colleagues and co-inventing together and collaborating and using all those great C words that help us move forward together.
Well, Nancy, we do need to close out the meeting room.
So,
I know we could stay here all day and just discuss all of these great things.
So thank you so much. I so enjoyed, and thanks for your comments. It's been great. It's been a little hard to keep up with all of them, but you know, you've given me lots of ideas too. And I hope to see you maybe one of these days in person, or see you online again, perhaps at our ALA conference in next week, 2 weeks, whenever it is. So bye-bye, and thanks so much.